I felt the weight of the badge in my palm like a second heartbeat and set it on the conference table without flinching, letting the plastic click echo. Evan Walker straightened his jacket and smiled the way sharks do when they smell blood. "Congratulations, Sam, you're terminated, effective immediately," he said like he was announcing a promotion. 2 dozen coworkers sat around us, some looking away as if shame could hide them, others leaning forward like it was opening night. My brain ran the list of things that couldn't wait. Rent in 3 weeks, Maria's operations director, insulin refill next Tuesday, 12 years left on the mortgage. Training taught me to think with pressure, not panic, count supplies, assess exits, pick a route. I let a beat sit heavy in the room and then said, "Evan, you should pull up the monitoring dashboard. There's a countdown you shouldn't ignore." Silence slammed into us. Someone fumbled for a laptop and pinged the system. Someone else bolted for the door like they'd missed their last bus. Maria, who'd been a CB like me, saw the look and went still. Panic spread across faces that had been smug 5 minutes earlier, and for the first time I watched corporate certainty break like thin ice. Evan's grin started to slide into something wet and human. He barked a question, "What did you do?" like he thought it was a prank. I didn't answer his theatrics. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket and showed him the dashboard feed: red alerts, failing heartbeats across production clusters, authorization tokens revoked, queues stalled. "You pulled my admin rights," I said. "That triggered the protective state I built years ago." The system went into hibernation. Brad, the CTO, swore and began hammering at a terminal. 2 engineers sprinted toward the server room like paramedics racing a patient across a parking lot. You could see the math happening on some faces. How much revenue would evaporate in an hour, a day, and the room smelled like fear and cheap cologne. I stood up slowly, clipped my badge back on, and took the cardboard box they gave me for my things. It had a mug, a picture of Austin's son, and a small flag my boy had folded and given me. The room watched me pack like they were watching a verdict. Evan lunged to stop me, voice high. "You can't just, this is criminal." He tried to make it sound like the old rules applied. I handed him a printout of access logs and code commits and showed him the exact timestamp of his unauthorized revocation. "You triggered it," I told him. "You made the decision that proves why the protective logic existed." The weight of evidence sat on the table like a second box. His face lost color, then composure. I said nothing about revenge. I wanted leverage, not prison time. My aim was to force them to face what they'd built and who actually kept it running. The first text I ignored was from legal. The second was from an investor with too many initials. Maria stepped forward, voice low. "Sam, can you restore it?" she asked, not as a plea but as an order in the old language we shared. She knew the code better than most because we'd written pieces of it together. I pulled up the protocol on my laptop and explained plainly. The system needed multi-source reauthorization. It required Evan to acknowledge his action, sign a statement admitting the revocation was unauthorized, and then we could walk through a phased restoration with oversight. "You expect him to sign?" Evan barked. He sounded frantic now and his hands trembled as he reached for his phone. I told him the alternative: litigation, regulators, clients losing faith, and possible criminal inquiries. The board would not want that, neither would the investors who cared about exit timing. He asked what I wanted. I could have asked for millions and walked away cold. Instead, I named terms that mattered to the people in my life and the work on the table. A measurable stake in the patents I helped author, restitution enough to cover the damage they'd caused to my family's stability, immediate reinstatement with authority to keep this from happening again, and a public acknowledgement of my role. I watched his eyes trace my living room in my head, maybe catching a glimpse of the names on my mortgage and the calendar for Maria's refill. Behind him, the legal team was dialing, and in the hall I could hear worried voices. He hesitated, then signed. Watching that pen move felt like a bell. It wasn't about winning, it was about making them reckon with the cost of treating people like lines on a spreadsheet. When I left the building that day, I didn't slump. I walked steady, took the long way home, stopped at the old coffee shop on Oak for a beer of courage that nobody knew to ask for. People called and texted and begged, but I let them sit unanswered for a while. The system stayed dark until the paperwork was in my hands and the public narrative could be controlled. Maria and Brad came to my house later that evening, asking for guidance like junior officers with a broken mission. We worked through restoration steps together, methodical and cold. In the meantime, I watched the company flail on its own. It was a strange satisfaction to know the skeleton they'd been selling had me as its spine. They'd tried to erase me. Instead, they forced everyone to remember what built the company in the first place. I picked up the little cardboard box they'd given me for personal things. Photos, a battered coffee mug, the small flag my son had folded and handed me years ago, and walked out without saying what I'd done. In the hallway, my phone buzzed like a warning bell. I glanced down, 7 minutes and change on the countdown I'd started and left running. The building smelled like recirculated air and fear. People passed me in the corridor with eyes full of questions they didn't dare ask. I let them have those questions. I was tired of explaining myself to people who decided sooner than they should have. The phone kept lighting up. Unknown numbers, Evan legal investors. I turned it over and let it vibrate on a bench while I watched the company try to breathe without its engine. Right on schedule, Meridian Logistics went dark. Not a handful of services hiccuped, everything locked into the state I'd built for emergencies. Production servers stopped responding to requests. Client portals froze in mid-session. Warehouse scanners went momentarily blind. The delivery chains we managed went still on dashboards that stopped updating. It looked like a ghost town of blinking lights. I felt no victory in that quiet, only the thin satisfaction of confirmation. The product belonged to the design, and the design knew how to protect itself. Someone in management called me a saboteur in public chats. Someone else called for arrest. The legal notices started sliding across inboxes like cold envelopes. I watched headlines appear in my head. Startup halts operations, major disruption at logistics firm. I didn't call reporters. I didn't need to. Let them spin. The truth would surface where the code met the contracts. For the clients, it was a test. How quickly could the company show control and responsibility? For investors, it was panic time math. Projected exits, monthly burn, how much a week of downtime would cost. For families like mine, it was the immediate thud of consequences. I thought of Maria's insulin of the mortgage and kept my feet on the pavement. I walked to the nearby coffee shop on Oak Avenue and ordered a black coffee I'd been avoiding for years. The barista knew my name by habit and offered a grin that didn't reach her eyes. I sat at the corner table and watched my phone light up. Evan left frantic voicemails. Brad sent terse messages about access tokens and emergency keys. Maria texted one word, help. I didn't rush to answer. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they'd tried to do. They had tried to scrub me out. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. They had tried to erase the chain of custody that proved who built what. For 17 years, I'd been careful to make the system accountable to more than an email and a title. The protection was blunt, yes, but legal, and most importantly, it worked. An hour in, the company still hadn't restored service. Customers started calling our support line only to get recorded messages explaining we were handling an unplanned protective shutdown. That phrasing was deliberate. It framed the event as a safety measure rather than sabotage. Clients who understood tech called us directly. Some were calm, some were furious. A few firms with rigid SLAs, service-level agreements, threatened to pull contracts. That was expected. My job then became simple. Control the variables we could control and show a path to resolution that looked reasonable to a judge, a client, and a boardroom. By mid-afternoon, Maria came to my house. She arrived without fanfare, like a person who'd been awake too long. She sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm. Sam, she said, voice low, we need you to bring it back online. She didn't ask if I was angry. She didn't ask if I had a right. She spoke as someone who knew the system and the consequences. We went through the steps: multi-party authorization, signed attestations, forensic logs to be handed to counsel and regulators. I told her the rules plainly. Evan had to acknowledge his action and sign a statement that matched what the logs showed. That would start the phased restore. No signature, no restore. Simple, firm, and meant to protect both the clients and the integrity of the platform. Evan showed up at my door that evening dressed like he'd slept on a pile of contracts. He tried charm, then bluster, then anger. Fix this now, he demanded, like throwing words could demand code into motion. I opened my laptop and showed him the record. The revocation came from his account at 4:36 p.m. He had triggered the lock. The logs were clean and ugly. He reached for his phone and then his face fell. He had an expected system designed to push back. I told him what I wanted: terms that would keep my family safe and keep the product honest. He tried to negotiate down. I reminded him that paper was cheap. Code was harder to erase. When he finally signed the acknowledgement and restitution terms, the relief in the room was quiet and complicated. We walked through the restore sequence over the next few hours, step by step, with Maria watching every log. Production systems came back online in stages, less to do with drama and more to do with discipline. Clients returned to operations. Investors stopped pacing. The legal team began drafting notes for regulators explaining the emergency measures. That night, I sat on my back steps and drank a beer with my shirt off, like a man who had just completed a long shift and wasn't yet sure whether to sleep or start rebuilding. In the days that followed, the company smelled different. The people who ignored me before cleared their throats before speaking. Engineers queued to ask questions. The board treated me as more than a former employee. Contracts were rewritten, patents reassigned, and a quiet order settled in. We didn't fix everything in a week. We fixed the parts that had to be fixed first, people's livelihoods, clients' trust, and the paperwork that finally matched the reality of who owned the work. Meridian Logistics kept running after that, but the lesson stuck with everyone who watched it unfold. Sometimes you have to make them stop to make them notice. I drove home the long way like I had time to kill, and like the day hadn't just hollered at the edges of everything I owned. I pulled into the driveway, walked up the steps slow, and acted casual as if my chest didn't feel like a drum. Inside the house, I powered my phone off and shoved it in a drawer. I ordered the kids' favorite takeout because routines matter even when the world tilts. I put on a documentary about wartime logistics. Dry, factual, exactly the kind of thing that made the logic of what I'd done feel less like spite and more like a tool. I wanted background noise and something adult to watch while my head worked through the next steps. Messages blew up the moment I turned the phone back on for a second to confirm the order. Evan, CEO, left 3 voicemails before I finished the first bite of spring rolls. Brad, CTO, sent me terse technical questions that smelled like panic. Investors texted with lots of initials and zero patience. Lawyers started circle called on someone else's end. I let them hang, I let them stew. The point of the shutdown wasn't to break things for drama. It was to force a question into play. Who controls this, and do they have the morals to hold it? People who build things for a living understand that control is a duty more than an asset. You get the duty right, or you write a lot of angry emails later. At 5:30, Austin's son padded downstairs with that nervous energy kids get when they're proud of something. He dropped his backpack by the couch, pulled out a folder, and sat across from me like a young man ready to talk about missions that matter. "Dad," he said, voice bright, "I finished my scholarship essay on leadership and integrity. I wrote about taking care of your team." He spread the pages in front of me and I thumbed them. He'd taken lines I'd lived for years, mission first, protect the team, and turned them into a college pitch. I felt small and big at the same time. "That's good work," I told him, honest and quick. "You said what mattered most." He grinned, went back to his studies, and didn't need to hear the rest of my day's drama. We ate at the kitchen table with forks and plastic plates and the TV humming facts about supply chains and cold weather convoys. Linda's wife wasn't home. She was at a book group and would come back later, smiling and unaware, which was fine. My daughter's cheer practice had called, so Emily's daughter would be late too. The house felt like a pause in a fight, safe, short, temporary. I told Austin it might all turn out better soon. I meant it, and I didn't. He asked, "You always knew it would work out, Dad." I thought of the CB maxim we used to say on deployment: prepare, then trust your plan. "I didn't know," I admitted. "I prepared, that counts for something." He nodded, satisfied with my half-truth. After dinner, I brewed a second cup of coffee and sat at the counter with the box of things they'd given me earlier still on the floor by the door. Photos, a battered mug, and the small flag my boy had folded years ago were in there like evidence of a life. Messages kept pinging the drawer-bound phone like flies against glass. Brad sent a link to a terminal dump. Maria, operations director, texted a line: "Evidence is lining up. We need signatures." Her text read like an order and a plea at once. She knew what a forensic trail could do, cut like paper through denial. I typed back a calm plan: phased restoration only after documented acknowledgement. Send a copy to council. Bring in auditors, no shortcuts. At 8, Evan arrived at the house with a man who looked like he carried anxiety in a suit. He tried to charm first. "Sam, this is bad for everyone. We can make this go away." He sounded small when he said it. I opened my laptop and pulled up the logs. "The revocation came from your account at 4:36, I said plainly. He stared at the timestamp like it was a thermometer telling him he had a fever. He tried to explain, to point fingers, to make shadow arguments. I didn't argue. I laid out terms: public acknowledgement, a stake in the patents, restitution, and reinstatement with authority to harden access. He balked, then paused, then asked low, "What happens if I don't?" I looked at him and said, "Then I start the legal clock and you explain to clients why you couldn't protect their data." When he finally signed the paperwork later that night, it felt like pulling a line tight on a boat. We walked through the restore sequence together with Maria and Brad watching every log as if they were scanning a patient's vitals. Systems came back in phases. Clients got controlled updates. Investors stopped circling like vultures and started asking practical questions again. I sat on the back steps afterward, beer in hand, and watched the neighborhood breathe. The kids' futures hadn't been ruined. Maria's insulin would stay on schedule. The mortgage still stood. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean, but the rules had been reset, and that mattered more than the temporary thrill of revenge. At 6:15 there was a deliberate knock, and I opened the door to find Maria, operations director, and Brad, CTO, standing on the porch like men who'd been awake too long. They walked in without small talk, boots still carrying the smell of the server room. Maria's eyes were flat and sharp. Brad's shirt was untucked and he kept rubbing at a laptop-shaped bruise on his forehead from stress. They sat down like junior officers reporting an emergency, voices clipped, hands busy with their own lists. Full lockdown, Brad said without preamble. Production is offline, clients are disconnected, legal is already getting notices, we're bleeding, he added, the numbers invisible but sharp in his tone. Maria spread a timeline on the coffee table and pointed at a single, ugly entry. Credential revocation at 4:36 p.m., she said. Whoever did this triggered the quarantine. It was the kind of statement that made everything else in the room turn toward me like a magnet. I didn't let my face give anything away. I told them the same thing I'd thought and tested for years. I'd written a failsafe when the product was young and fragile, the kind of defensive move you make when the stakes are people's jobs and customers' livelihoods. If my privileges are revoked without proper multi-factor reauthorization, I said, the system assumes a hostile takeover and quarantines itself. It stops making calls, it isolates client sessions, and it won't come back until authorization is re-established through a predefined, verifiable chain. Maria's jaw tightened. She'd helped write parts of that logic. She knew it wasn't cruft, it was armor. Brad asked quietly, do you still have access? Like a soldier asking whether the ammunition pile was real. Of course I had access. Of course I had built a way back in the same afternoon I built the failsafe. It was the only way the failsafe would ever be acceptable to put into production. I pulled my laptop open and laid the dashboard out where they could see it. Red alerts blinked like distress signals, stalled queues, frozen client sessions, quarantined data containers. Everything's intact, I said, but everything's offline, data's safe, no corruption, no deletion, that's deliberate. Maria ran a finger over a blocked process and said, so it didn't drain anything, thank God. Brad, who'd been chewing at a response, looked half relieved and half furious. We can restore, he said, but only under controlled conditions. If anyone tries to flip us back on without the right procedure, it will lock again and the audit trail will be proof. I agreed. The locks were part of the narrative, clear, defensible, and traceable, so that regulators and clients might see the decision tree instead of smoke. Then they asked the question that mattered. What will you take to bring it back? Maria's voice sounded tired but direct. We all knew what this was, negotiation in the middle of a crisis. I told them plain terms that weren't vengeful, only firm. Evan has to come here, I said. He has to acknowledge in writing that he revoked my credentials without proper authorization, and he must agree to specific restitution and structural changes to access controls. A public acknowledgement, reassignment of patent credits where appropriate, a defined compensation for the disruption, and my reinstatement with authority to harden the platform. Nothing shady, everything transparent. Brad's face softened when I mentioned the hardening piece. He had been trying to get those responsibilities for months without the authority to change governance. Maria swallowed and said, those terms protect the clients and the company. They make this right. They looked at each other and then at me, tired officers ready to follow a plan. Maria asked how long a phased restoration would take once the signatures were on the table. I answered honestly, a few hours for core services, a day for dependent workflows, 3 days for full client reconciliation. It wasn't a bluff. We talked through the technical steps, certificate rotation, token exchange, API gateway handshakes, and client verifications. We also talked about optics, how to frame the shutdown to clients as a preemptive safety measure rather than malicious sabotage. Tell them we prioritize data integrity over uptime, I said. That's the truth and it's defensible. Brad took notes like a man taking inventory before a long job. They called Evan. He arrived an hour later, tie crooked, hands apologetic in front of him. He tried to be small and big at once like men do when they tack between ego and consequence. I handed him a folder and watched his face read the logs, the timestamps, and the legal language. He tried a few lines, bluster, then charm, then a weak attempt at denial. But when the evidence sat on the table, the truth had a gravity all its own. He signed the acknowledgement with hands that trembled, wrote the restitution numbers down, and agreed to the governance changes that would keep this from happening again. We began the phased restore immediately after signatures were exchanged, methodical and legal. I watched the enterprise come back online piece by piece and felt a kind of quiet satisfaction, not from hurting them, but from finally making them match their paperwork to reality. They called Evan CEO. Within 20 minutes his luxury sedan screeched into my driveway and he stormed up my walk, hair messy, tie loosened, face showing the strain of investors and reporters calling. He tried to push past me into the house, barking that I needed to turn the system back on right now. I kept the door between us and called him in like we were still colleagues, voice flat. Sit down, Evan, I said. He planted himself like he owned the couch, hands jittery, like caffeine and adrenaline had become a new perfume. Ordered loud. This is sabotage, he spat. You had no right, there are legal consequences. The FBI, he kept spinning threats like a man trying to knit a net from noise. I shut that down with one simple move. I opened my laptop and pulled up the dashboard where the logs lived. Then I began to lay paper copies across the coffee table, letting them slide into view like cards in a hand. You signed into the admin console at 4:36 p.m., I said. That's the revocation log. That action dropped my privileges, and the failsafe you so often praised triggered what it was built to do. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, trying to catch a loophole. I kept talking. I showed him access history prints with IP addresses and windows of activity that matched his badge swipes and the times his assistant said he was in meetings. I spread code snapshots that included commit hashes and timestamps. My handwriting and comments from years ago, lines of middleware only a few of us touched. I opened an email thread on my phone and let him read the messages where a private equity contact discussed extracting core team dependencies. His face lost color when he read his own words. The audit trail didn't care if he was well-intentioned or panicked. It recorded sequence and intent. He tried to argue with the paper. You could have locked us out intentionally, he said, like throwing mud might conceal the print. I tapped a timestamp that showed a series of off-hours downloads originating from an account tied to him. I pointed to a cluster of failed login attempts that matched his pattern of remote access when he traveled. We can trace all of this, I said. Forensics will line up the story exactly as it is here. The swagger he used to wear like armor began to drain out of him. His hands started to shake. Evan asked what I wanted, like a man bargaining at the edge of a cliff. I told him the same things I'd told Maria and Brad, terms that were hard but fair. Public acknowledgement that you revoked access without proper authorization, reassignment of credit where the patents show work I authored, restitution to cover the personal damage to my family, and reinstatement with authority to harden controls so this can't happen again. I watched his eyes move from the logs to the folder of photos I had packed earlier. Austin's folded flag, a coffee mug, a note from my daughter. Those weren't bargaining chips so much as proof of why I wanted this done right. He tried a few weak defenses, blame a board committee, claim misread priorities, promise future governance changes. None of it mattered in the face of timestamps and code. He started to look smaller, like the suit was a costume that no longer fit. At one point he muttered, "If I sign, will you restore everything?" I nodded and explained the staged process. Signatures first, legal copies to counsel, and then we run a phased restore that rotates certificates, exchanges tokens, and verifies client handshakes. No shortcuts, no moral hazard. He swallowed and asked if the press would be kept out. I told him we could control the narrative if we handled this cleanly and honestly. Lies spread faster than truth in panic. Honesty slows the rot. He reached for a pen with two hands like a man who might drop it. The first signature was small, barely a scratch. Later, when he signed the formal restitution language, his hand was steadier but not proud. We watched him write what he had tried to avoid saying out loud. The act didn't humiliate him on paper, it simply anchored reality. I filed the signed documents into my folder and told him the restore sequence would begin once counsel confirmed the wording. He looked like a man exhausted by consequence and finally ready to accept it. After he left, I sat back and felt a strange quiet. Everything I laid out was meticulous because life had taught me that paper and logs matter as much as guts and skill. You build things to outlast mistakes, not to be flaunted by them. The system came back in stages over the next hours after counsel confirmed the signatures. Clients received careful notifications and status updates. Board members called to ask how this had been allowed to happen, and we gave them the factual timeline instead of drama. For once, the company had to reckon with the difference between owning a title and owning a product. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because the work deserved protection, and because my family and the people who trusted the platform needed a line drawn in the sand. I told him what I wanted and I said it plain. 20% ownership of the patents that make Meridian's platform what it is, I said. $6 million in compensation for the attempt to steal the IP and for the personal damage you've caused. Immediate reinstatement as CTO with real authority and a permanent seat on the board, and a public acknowledgement that I am the systems architect behind this platform. The words felt heavy in the room, like ordnance laid down on a table. He sat there and blinked, like someone trying to figure which part of reality was on fire. He hesitated and tried to bargain around the edges. "That's a lot," he said. 20% of what that value is." He didn't finish. The investors had been on his back for months, the headlines were already drafting themselves in his head, and the board would want answers faster than he could produce them. Maria, operations director, murmured under her breath in a tone I recognized from deployments. Pragmatic. 20% is better than watching them come in and peel the company apart, she said, quiet enough not to make it a public pressure. Brad, CTO, started doing math with his mind and then aloud, ticking off revenue projections and client churn numbers like a man counting rations. If key clients walk because this looks like instability, he said, we're talking real dollars lost in quarters, not weeks. That image shook the room. Contracts signed, trucks rerouted, warehouses left idle because confidence evaporated. Evan's mouth opened and closed, working on excuses as if they were life jackets. He tried to paint it as a panicked single action to protect the company. The truth was already on paper, timestamps, off-hours, downloads tied to his account, threads where someone suggested extracting team dependencies. The audit trail didn't care about panic or intent, it showed sequence and consequence. He looked smaller than the suit he wore. He reached for the pen like a man trying to avoid touching a hot stove. I can offer governance changes, he said weakly, restructured oversight, a PR statement. His words fell on the folder with the logs and the signed initial admission that sat in front of him. I watched him weigh the three realities in front of him: investor fury, legal exposure, and the possibility of losing clients who'd built their operations on our uptime. He shifted in his seat like a man who had been standing in one spot on a ship as it took on water. In the end, the calculus was simple for him. Sign and keep something of the company intact, or refuse and risk losing everything to lawsuits, regulators, and a mass exodus. He signed. The pen scratched across the paper with a small, final sound. He looked like a man conceding a battle he had started. When he handed the pen back, I felt a mix of things: relief, fatigue, and a clear sense of what this meant for my family. I didn't gloat. I laid out the restoration plan and the governance changes we needed to make sure this never happened again. Partners don't steal from partners, I told him, voice level and steady. If you ever try this again, you'll be signing a different kind of ending. He swallowed and muttered something about moving forward and learning from mistakes. I didn't ask for apologies that might be shallow. I asked for accountability written into the company's operating documents. We spelled out the mechanics right there. A phased systems restore after council verified the wording, a public statement acknowledging the protective shutdown and its cause, the transfer and registration of patent credits, escrow for the restitution payment so it couldn't be delayed, and an immediate restructuring of access controls with my authority to enforce them. Brad wanted a timeline. Maria wanted the legal language nailed down so clients wouldn't panic. I told them the sequence: signatures first, council review second, and then a staged restore with independent auditors watching the logs. It wasn't dramatic, it was mechanical work like any repair job. The documents were dry but binding, and binding is what mattered. After we finished, the room felt different. There was no triumphant music, no vindictive dance. There was a reset of responsibility and a new set of fences around the work we'd done. Things at home felt different too, less precarious. The $6 million I asked for wasn't a vanity number. It covered legal exposure for my family, a cushion for the turmoil they'd been put through, and compensation for years of value that had been nearly stolen. The 20% wasn't greed. It was ensuring the people who actually built the product had real governance and a stake when choices were made. Evan left quieter than he had arrived. Maria and Brad stayed to start paperwork and to plan the restore. We began the phased bring-up that night, slow and careful, rotating certificates, exchanging tokens, and verifying each client handshake. The system came back in stages, and each successful step folded into the next like a sequence of well-drilled motions. I sat there while logs turned from red to amber to green, thinking about how you make people listen when titles and promises stop being enough. In the end, it wasn't about humiliation or spite. It was about making sure the work was owned by the people who earned it, and that no one could casually erase that effort ever again. I walked into Meridian the next morning carrying the folder with signatures like a shield, and felt the room change around me the second the door closed. I had a new title now, 20% owner, and a seat on the board, and people noticed. Conversations that had been quiet when I was an ex-employee picked back up as I entered rooms. Junior developers who used to avoid eye contact now approached me to ask about architecture and resilience. I answered bluntly and clearly, the way I'd taught teams in the field. Prioritize the mission, protect your people, make your fixes durable. The coffee in the break room tasted the same, but the weight of who I was in the building was different and immediate. The first boardroom felt like walking into a different kind of war. Evan, CEO, sat with a thinner smile and eyes that watched my hands. Whitaker from finance led with numbers and a paper stack. I planted my report on the table and walked them through it step by step. System is fully operational, I said. Clients are back online. SLAs met where possible. We staged restores to avoid cascading failures. No data was lost. Forensic logs are archived and accessible for audits. Whitaker tapped a pen and asked the question that mattered financially. Client retention? I nodded and explained plainly what we'd done with messaging. We framed the shutdown as a deliberate protective measure that prioritized client data integrity over uptime. Transatlantic stayed, I said. Most European accounts stayed when we presented the decision as a safeguard. The math in the room shifted as people realized the story could be sold as competence, not catastrophe. The press, as usual, found a version that fit headlines. We briefed counsel and crafted a statement that emphasized advanced protections against unauthorized control. The story that launched said we had activated a security protocol designed to protect client systems in case of suspected takeover. That framing changed tone. Investors calmed in stages. Clients stopped drafting termination letters and started asking about hardened service-level agreements and new access controls. Whitaker still asked tough questions about churn and churn risk. I answered with metrics and a plan. Show what we fixed, measure the next quarter, and tie executive bonuses to uptime and security outcomes rather than short-term cost cuts. I proposed operational upgrades that were plain and measurable: rotate keys on a fixed schedule, move governance-critical actions behind multi-party escrow, implement transparent audit trails with third-party observers, and fund a small security ops team led by Maria, operations director, with proper authority. I laid out efficiency improvements too: consolidate redundant pipelines, reduce single points of failure in middleware, and enforce code review rules that stopped midnight commits from shipping without oversight. Brad, CTO, had been pushing parts of this for months but lacked governance teeth. Now he had them. He stood up and walked through implementation timelines with the kind of focus you see when engineers get permission to do the work they know matters. The company shifted almost overnight from short-term cuts to a strategy mindset. Teams stopped trimming muscle and started investing in bone structure that would keep us standing in bad weather. Product roadmaps regained technical rigor instead of glorified guesswork. Junior staff stopped worrying whether speaking up would mean being sidelined. They saw accountable governance and a clear chain of command. Evan adapted because the reality of the board and investor scrutiny made adaptation necessary. He held on to the CEO role but with a new posture, more cautious, more consultative, and visibly constrained by the checks we put in place. He learned, perhaps too late, that titles don't trump architecture or accountability. We rewrote policy language to make access revocation an escalated board event, not a unilateral action. We assigned patent credits where they belonged and set up an escrow for restitution payments to be released on a clear schedule. I asked for nothing that would let me act in secret. I wanted transparency. The agreements we signed reflected that. That day, Brad and Maria and I walked the system logs together in a meeting with legal and external auditors, watching the evidence line up against the narrative. It felt like cleaning a wound with a bright light, uncomfortable, necessary, and oddly reassuring. After the board meeting, developers clustered at the hallway like sailors eager to get back to a steady sea. A junior engineer asked, "Can we test the circuit breakers?" And I laughed and said, "Yes, but not during demo day." People wanted to be useful again. At home that night, Linda's wife asked how the meeting went, and I told her it was the start of making the work match the words. Austin's son sent a text that said, "Proud of you, Dad," and I nearly dropped my keys. The numbers would matter later, how much our stock moved, how revenues trended, but the immediate change was one I felt in the ankles: steadier footing, fewer surprises. We spent the following weeks reinforcing controls, onboarding auditors, and making the narrative simple. We protected client data by design, and our governance would make sure no single person could unilaterally endanger the business again. The company didn't become perfect overnight. Mistakes still happened. But the difference was this: people listened now when I said the work came first, and the board backed actions with authority. That kind of alignment doesn't fix everything, but it keeps the ship from listing the next time the weather turns. At home, the air settled and the small things shifted first. Linda's wife didn't have to worry about whether to skip a refill anymore because her meds were covered under our new executive health plan. I watched her relax in a way she hadn't in months, the tight line around her mouth easing into something softer. Austin's son stopped worrying about whether he could finish school. His tuition had a real plan now, not just chances and wishful emails. Emily's daughter started asking questions about majors and scholarships with a smile I hadn't seen since the earlier weeks of fear. Those everyday anxieties that live in the corners of a life started moving to the middle of the room where they belonged. Fixed, accounted for, not bargaining chips in a boardroom. Maria came by one afternoon with a coffee and a look that said she needed to say the words she'd been holding. She admitted she and others had assumed I'd land on my feet, that they had trusted Evan to have a plan. It was a blunt, corporate kind of apology, no theater, just honesty. She said, "We should have stood up with you." I told her it was okay. People make choices under pressure, and fear narrows vision. Her apology mattered because it came with action. She took the lead on staffing the security ops team and pushed for the governance changes to be written into policy. That was the kind of repair I wanted. Fixes that stop the space for the mistake to happen again. Austin told me one night as we sat at the kitchen counter that his scholarship essay had gotten attention. He said he might study cybersecurity now, that he wanted to build systems that protected people the way I'd built one when the company was under threat. I felt a swell of pride that was quiet and sharp. Good, I told him. Make it hard for people to do the wrong thing, build with the little things in mind. He nodded like a man deciding a path, not a kid asking permission. Watching him think in that direction felt like a passing of a baton I hadn't known I wanted to pass. A Meridian investor reached out months later with a polite pitch for a side partnership and some code sharing between their new fund and our platform. I listened to the offer for 5 minutes and then closed the door politely. I told him the company and our IP were off limits for outside play. I said it calmly and with the kind of quiet distance that makes a person stop pushing. He backed off. That moment wasn't about anger, it was boundary setting. We had learned that when you build something people depend on, you don't lease out the parts that keep them safe. Business moved forward in ways that felt both inevitable and oddly steady. 6 months in Meridian posted record profits and pushed into markets we'd talked about for years but had never had the discipline to enter properly. We hired a few security engineers, a compliance officer, and dedicated a small fund to client-facing resilience contracts. The product matured because the company stopped chasing growth at the expense of its spine. Evan stayed on as CEO, but his posture changed. He met people now who had actual authority to veto risky moves. He listened to technical leads before signing press releases. That change in him wasn't theatrical, it was practical. The investors who'd been ready to cheer a shaky exit now had to value durability. Some nights I sit on the back porch with a beer and a simple glass and watch kids in the neighborhood run until their muscles complain. The streetlights blink on like old constellations and the world looks plain and orderly. I think about what I've taught my kids and what I try to teach the engineers who now come to me for guidance. Competence matters. Show up with skill and finish the job. Integrity is non-negotiable. If you cut corners to hit a number, you'll lose more than you gain. And sometimes preparing for the worst is not pessimism, it's protection. You don't build safeties to be cruel, you build them so the people who count on you sleep at night. There were small victories that didn't make the papers. Maria's insulin refill stayed on schedule without a late-night panic. Austin received his scholarship letter and called me with a voice that shook a little from holding back tears. Emily opened a bank account with a deposit earmarked for college. Those were real outcomes, not headlines, and they mattered to me more than any investor memo. The restitution funds and ownership stake had stabilized our home, the way a good foundation stabilizes a house in a storm. Work continued to have its problems. Not everything went smooth. We had outages from third-party providers and a few teams still pushed for faster launches over safer designs. But the culture tilted. People asked, how does this affect the customer? Before they asked, how does this hit the quarter? That change came from policy, from incentives, and from the fact that the people who built the system could now protect it in the boardroom as well as in code. That alignment meant fewer surprises and more respect for the craft of building reliable systems. Sometimes I think about the moment I clipped my badge back onto my belt and carried that cardboard box out of a conference room. It feels like a hinge point now, not a cliff. We could have walked away or we could have let a paper trail and a few signatures decide our fate. Instead, we chose to make the work and the legal record match. That choice kept a roof over our heads, medicine in a drawer, and hope in a kid's scholarship letter. It taught people who once equated leadership with bold moves that true leadership is often the willingness to protect what you've built, even when the cost is standing your ground. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts.